session is about the conflict management and resolution. What we do is I give you a broader picture of conflict management and resolution or approaches to conflict. Before we go into detail, it's better to have a broader picture, theoretical picture. So I give you a broader picture of conflict management and resolution. And this Galton's conflict triangle, and whether conflict is big or small, we have three important elements to study: behavior, contradiction, and attitude. So if we want to stop conflict or de-escalate conflict, what we need to do is we need to work on these 3 points. For instance, if we stop violence, fighting of the party, peacekeeping will be undertaken. If we want to change the attitude, we use the term peacemaking. So peacemaking is trying to change the views and ways they perceive the situation. So peacemaking. And to remove contradiction, there are various activities. Maybe we provide more resources, we remove the contradictions of the party, which we call it peace building. So peace building, peacemaking are very, very closely linked, and parties of conflict usually do not distinguish those two elements, attitudes and contradiction, because they are not the experts of the conflict. So they consider they are angry because of the grievances that they may have, but they view peacemaking, peace building more closer context. So if we look at international use of the term, for instance, United Nations use peace operation, the term peace operations. Peace operation include peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building. So when the action include all these 3 factors, they usually call peace operation instead of peacekeeping or peacemaking. Peacekeeping is to stop violence, maintain, ceasefire agreement, so monitoring. And this is the scene of peacemaking. Typically, political leaders come up with agreement, certain agreement. And the person in the middle would be perhaps mediator. And peace building include various activities like removing arms from the society, giving vocational training to the former fighters, etc. When we try to de-escalate the conflict, we need various activities. There is no magic formula to stop conflict. So in order to take action, we need to first analyze conflict, at what stage the conflict is. The easiest way is to look at the parties' behavior. If they are fighting, it's at war, at the worst stage of conflict. And it may not yet reach the violence, but there may be some attitude that parties show, like ignoring each other, stop communication, polarization. So at each stage of a conflict, there are particular conflict parties' behavior and attitude. So you must analyze what stage the conflict is. And of course, when the conflict de-escalates, there may be first ceasefire agreement, stop violence, and also further peace agreement in which parties of conflict agree how they organize security and order after they stop violence. So this agreement is also important. And gradually normalized relation and reconciliation will be undertaken. So this is the whole process, but in practice, it is not easy because sometimes after ceasefire, people start fighting again. So this conflict wave up and down all the time. And it is you who analyze at what stage the conflict is and what strategy is necessary can be assessed based on the stage of armed conflict. So this is a kind of model. And if we look at the different model, this is a famous hourglass model. From top to middle, conflict escalate, starting from difference, contradiction, polarization, violence, and war. And from middle to bottom, conflict de-escalate. And the right side, left side is an approach to conflict. Depends on at what stage the conflict is, you employ different stages. When violence is still ongoing, you need peacekeeping. Whereas when the violence stopped, you may need peacemaking and peace building. At each stage of conflict, we need to employ appropriate method to intervene or to stop, to change the situation. Another important issue is, okay, higher top level politicians may come up with agreement to stop conflict, but people in the grassroots may continue to fight. So important thing is we need to work on not only higher level of the society, but middle and bottom level of society in order to really achieve peace. And you need to remember the term track 1, track 2, track 3, because practitioners usually use these terms quite regularly. What does it mean? Top level, track 1 is the higher level, who are the political leaders, decision makers. So to stop conflict, obviously, track 1 is important. But the middle level is also important. Middle level is called track 2. Middle level include, for instance, religious leaders, community leaders, or traditional village leaders who have influential effects on top level decision making. So those who can influence over the political leaders. Academics sometimes included. Humanitarian workers or international workers are also included in the middle level. So sometimes you hear track 2 diplomacy. Track 2 diplomacy is if top level leaders cannot come up with agreement, we work on track 2 level and come up with an agreement between the parties, and then they can influence over the political leaders. So track 2 diplomacy is supposed to push up the decision to track 1. And track 3 is the grassroots level. Grassroots is also important because local peace is important. So community, developmental workers, health officials, refugee camp leaders, NGOs, these are grassroots level, track 3. So track 3 level of peace building is also vital because the population is much larger in the track 3. So in order to achieve thorough peace, we need to work on track 1, track 2, track 3. So all actors in each levels are important. As we see the track 1, track 2, track 3, okay, track 1, usually political leader in major cities, capital, large cities. But if we go to the local area, it's another story, and state security forces may not function well. In that case, it is a local actor who maintain security, who prevent violence in the local context. Because once violence happens, people are no longer patient. So even political leaders agree peace. Local actor may not be happy when violence is still ongoing, right? So local actors are important to prevent violence in their community itself. Because when violence is ongoing, nobody comes to believe the enemy stop conflict, right? So the most important step is to stop violence. Without it, people do not listen to what enemies say, right? So the local actor probably community or society, entire society require maintain security. That's the most important thing. So without local security, local community security, I don't think peace process will be possible because people continue to fight. So that is why track 3 is also important in achieving peace in the society. So peace building, particularly track 3 are considered the most important area because wide number of people are in local community. Many scholars uses those terms interchangeably, but precisely speaking, these are different terms. Conflict management is to limit or avoid violence by promoting positive attitude and behavior between the parties in conflict. Resolution is to resolve conflict by addressing the root causes. Can you identify the differences? What do you think? Which is ideal approach to conflict? Okay, there's no value judgment here because it highly depends on the context. Okay, if parties have capacity to listen to the enemy's voice, and then resolution may be possible. But if the party of conflict is still angry, extremely emotional, for instance, and then it's rather exacerbating if you start addressing the causes of a conflict. So sometimes parties need a cooling off period. And then you simply manage the conflict by preventing violence. So management is sometimes necessary because if the conflict is too complex and too difficult to identify the root causes, and then the important thing is to minimize violence first and maintain certain level of security, if not resolving root causes of conflict. So you, as a third person, may need to assess what's the best option right now. Should I go into the root causes, or should we wait to take more time for the parties to think, review their behavior and attitude? So management and resolution both are important, equally important. You employ the right approach at the right stage of conflict. So you need to carefully study the conflict stage. That's the idea. Sometimes in Southeast Asia, there are many conflicts, not only within a country, but also between states. Border disputes are everywhere in Southeast Asia. But fortunately, many of them are contained very well, managed very well. We don't see that many armed fighting between states in Southeast Asia. So some people say Southeast Asia employ conflict management well. And resolution may not be so possible soon, but for instance, if we look at Indonesia and Singapore, I think it resolved border dispute after 30 years. So conflict management has been employed over 30 years, but resolution is achieved after 30 years. So it highly depends on the stage and conflict parties situation. Conflict management is more about prevent violence. Peacekeeping can be part of it because in order to stop violence, perhaps military may be necessary to maintain security of the society. But behind the scene, there may be peacemaking effort. Okay, at least for the parties to have positive attitude. So to promote positive attitude, peacemaking is important. And of course, even behind the scene, conflict management may see the peace building too, because reducing the number of arms or contradictions are important. So behind the scene, there may be peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace building, all in both conflict management and resolution. But the difference is conflict resolution addresses the root causes of conflict together with conflict parties. Conflict transformation is much thorough, far-reaching strategy because it tried to change social political sources of conflict, transform negative energy to positive energy. So it's a thorough, deep approach with long-term strategy. So that is why the textbook that we use termed conflict transformation instead of peacemaking or peace building. And what is important for us to recognize is conflict transformation is trying to achieve peaceful development. In order to do so, parties may need to go into negotiation, from confrontation to negotiation. But what is important is conflict parties' powers are not always equal. In many cases, it's asymmetric, right? And those asymmetric conflicts are more difficult to resolve because those who are powerful do not want to compromise or come into negotiation because if they physically fight, they will win anyway. In that context, those who are powerful will not give up, right? So power balance is very important. If we try to achieve conflict transformation, this power balance has to be first because powerful do not want to yield or compromise, right? So when you come to a session of peacemaking, different resource persons introduce different cases. You can carefully observe how in each conflict, those power balance, like between state and armed group, how these power balance, asymmetric situation can be dealt with in the peace process. Because the states are usually more resource rich, available arms. So the important thing is states don't want to stop the conflict because they're gonna win anyway. But in the peace process, mediator, negotiator try to always balance those asymmetric power relations. We have different tools in peacemaking before negotiation. So we look at those different tools. You may know some of the terms, such as mediation. You may hear good office arbitration. Negotiation are the one that parties come to the table and discuss directly. This is ideal because parties can directly communicate and resolve their problem. But this is not always possible. So third party may help them to understand with each other. So these are the available tools for peacemaking. There are different types of third party intervention. When third party intervene in neutral position, and final decisions are sometimes made by the third party, sometimes decisions are made by conflictant. For instance, when we use the legal adjudication, such as court, bring the case to the court, okay? And then the judges decide the final outcome, right? Arbitration good office is similar, but not as formal as legal process. And if we look at other cases, mediation, problem solving, conciliation, consultation, in these cases, decisions are made by conflictant. Arbitration, it's a form of dealing with conflict dispute outside the court, but a third party or third parties involved to make a binding decision. So before the parties conflict enter into arbitration, they must agree, this person will do arbitration. So without this agreement, arbitration will not undertaken. So parties in conflict choose arbitrators, and arbitration is a neutral, but the decision is final. So arbitrators decide how to solve this problem. The process is confidential, but the final outcome is the binding one. Good office. This is also seen in international context. It's the assistance of a state or international body in establishing contact or beginning direct negotiation between the disputing parties. But it is not binding on the dispute parties. So unlike arbitration, good office is not binding decision. And it's also different from mediation, because a state rendering its good office essentially take no part in the negotiation themselves or in the examination of dispute. And in international context, sometimes we see those, for instance, under the UN Charter, UN Security Council in particular may offer its good offices to disputing parties. So UN Security Council sometimes offer good office. Broadly speaking, it's a neutral third-party assistance, and it uses special communication techniques, and mediators use various techniques to open or improve dialogue and empathy between disputants and to help the party to reach an agreement. So the success depends highly on the mediator's skills and training. So there's a special mediation trainings provided by different peace and conflict institutions. And the last one, conciliation, is conciliators try to lower tensions and improve communication or interpreting issues, encouraging parties to explore potential solutions and assist the parties to find a mutually acceptable outcome. So no judgment will be given by conciliator. So it's different from arbitration. So there are variations of tools for peacemaking, and it hardly depends on the parties which they prefer. And most conflict parties want to decide their outcome. So arbitration, which is decided by the third party, may not be so popular because, of course, parties of a conflict may want to control the situation. So there are many tools. And what we see in conflict context is here on the left side, we see from violence to discussion. So the purpose of de-escalating conflict is for the party to be able to discuss directly. So negotiation is the ultimate objective. But before coming to the negotiation, there are many efforts required, especially in prolonged conflict. Sometimes we use arbitration, sometimes we may use power mediation, problem solving, and conciliation, etc. So this is a model suggested by a conflict scholar, saying that at each stage of conflict, we need to apply appropriate method to de-escalate the conflict. So it's called the contingency model of third-party intervention. We now know in order to de-escalate the conflict, we have variations of tools, and which one you use depends on the context and your analysis of conflict. So there's no value judgment here. Those tools are useful in each context, and it's better to have those different tools to apply, because you may not know what conflict party want ultimately. So these are available tools developed in academic and practice for conflict de-escalation. If you want to resolve conflict, obviously you need to analyze conflict well. And the first important thing is to identify actors. In one conflict, there are many different actors. For instance, core parties, which are the main actor of the conflict, but there are also actively influential parties, marginal parties, uninvolved parties. So sometimes those uninvolved parties may not appear in conflict mapping, but there may be some influence from uninvolved party. For instance, economic assistance, providing arms behind the scene. So we need to carefully study the actors first. We need to study also root causes of conflict. What are the context, history, background, and past events, for instance? What are the actors' perception, feeling, which change over time? So this is a tricky thing because if conflict is prolonged, context change and perception change over time. So you need to regularly update, accumulate information about the context and the actors' perception, as well as who are the actors, who are the influential parties. And there's no magic formula to identify the root causes. But at least we know there are structural conditions for conflict, which sometimes people express as grievances. For instance, political, socio-economic factors, or other conditions that bring the party more conducive to conflict. And trigger factors or accelerating factors, particular event like assassination, killing political leaders, or particular actions, decisions that trigger conflict. So even if certain grievance exists in society without particular triggering event, it may not become a large conflict. So we need to carefully study structural condition, trigger factors, accelerating factors. And of course, these change over time. So we need to study the phases and dynamics of the conflict. You know, conflict in any country is complex enough. There are many root causes, not only one causes. So if we look at different level of causes, we can identify several major causes commonly seen in conflict. First one is resource availability. People say we don't have available economic resources, access to economic resources, political resources. This may be linked with survival or well-being of the people. And the socioeconomic disparity, political conditions, inequality. One particular region is more developed and accessible to education, healthcare. So distribution may be a question in this context. So well-being, freedom, these are part of common root causes of conflict. More outer factor is different identity groups, identity needs, for instance, ethnic, religious, or other identities. So what makes the conflict situation complex is those are closely interwoven. And sometimes we cannot separate those factors. Identity needs are usually used to justify socioeconomic grievances. So identify those factors is sometimes not easy because it's so much interwoven in the society in everyday life. There are material needs and non-material needs. So the root causes sometimes linked with survival, well-being, That's more physical, but also freedom and identity. This is a non-physical factor. So we need to carefully study those factors. As you see, the non-material factor is closely linked with our perception attitude. Material factor is closely linked with contradictions, our goals and objectives. So if you look at conflict analysis reports, we usually see history of the conflict as a commonly done, and it explore trigger events and underlying cultural factor. So these are usually linked with the root causes. That's why many conflict reports study those three factors in the very beginning. So as I said, after identifying the parties, we need to study what goals they have ultimately. But these goals are usually linked with their needs, what they try to really achieve by winning this conflict. It may be sometimes material needs, sometimes identity needs. So after identifying objectives of the party, you need to study what ultimate needs it satisfies: economic needs, political needs, social cultural needs. Each conflict has different causes, but causes are usually multiple. As time goes, more causes appears, and it evolves over time. And what is important is identify one particular cause is not sufficient. Understand how the causes interact with each other over time is important. So that is why we say conflict is context specific. We need to carefully study each conflict at each moment because it changes over time. But at the end of the day, we may not be able to resolve conflict completely, but we need to minimize violence in any case, because if violence happens, it becomes more difficult to resolve. So it also depends on how conflict parties approaches to the conflict. Some parties may not wish to encounter their enemy, while others want to discuss frankly with the enemy, right? So different actors have different approach. And if you are a third party, you also need to understand each party's approach to conflict. For instance, the horizontal line shows concern for yourself, and the vertical line shows concern for others. Okay? And if conflict party concern own issue, and then they may continue to claim their objective and justify their position. It becomes contending. And if the party concern for others, they yield. But usually we consider that in conflict context, both parties need to compromise, otherwise it will not possible to resolve. But some conflict resolution scholars say there's some possible cases where both parties satisfy their needs. That's what they call problem solving. So they develop problem solving approach in order to resolve conflict. Problem solving is one approach developed by conflict resolution scholars. If you are interested in that, you can look at the textbook. There's a problem solving approach. Not all conflicts ends with compromising, but sometimes it can bring both win-win solution for both parties. But you may get better understanding after this session, because you have particular cases and peace process sessions, and these gives you better understanding because it's more case-oriented sessions. So you hear how they overcome asymmetric situation or how they identify parties' needs and positions. But this session is to give you broader understanding, theoretical understanding of those sessions. So if you understand very roughly, that's fine. You achieve today's objective. Actually, that's why peace education, peace and conflict studies are important, because sometimes if we involve in conflict without recognition, we bring cultural difference, ethnicity, religious difference, or even nationality difference in the political context, or conflict core issue is some other issue, but we tend to bring those cultural differences to justify own violence or own, statement. And that makes the situation more complex and exacerbate the situation, right? So that is why we need to recognize first, we need to understand how conflict escalates, how cultural factors are used in the political process for conflict parties to justify their own claim. And they themselves recognize this, first of all, to prevent it. Because if they recognize it, they don't use cultural factor, because we cannot categorize people by just saying Christians and Muslim. Because within Christian, there are bad people, good people, right? So we cannot use those cultural factors in any way in political conflict or economic conflict. But many people actually do that in everyday life, right? In schools and in universities. That is why for me, everyday education is important. How we shouldn't use those cultural factors to justify own bad behavior, for instance, or bad claim or violence, etc. So that is why for me, we are here to study conflict in order to prevent such integration of cultural factor, other factor into particular conflict, because it makes the conflict situation more complex and difficult to resolve. That is why I think you are important in the conflict context to remind them this is not the right way to justify or own claim, or this is not the right thing to do when you justify your violence itself. Because conflict parties are not usually aware what they are doing, because they focus on to justify their own claim, their own action. But we need a recognition how those cultural factors are used to justify the conflict parties' behavior. For me, those cultural difference is not the cause of conflict. Because if you look at different countries around the world, not all countries where there are Muslims and Christians are in conflict, right? Some countries are in conflict, others are not. Why? Because those differences is not a vital factor, but only those countries that cultural differences are used in political process become conflict. And sometimes people call religious conflict ethnic conflict. But for me, they just symbolically use such terms. But in reality, the core conflict is much more economic political conflict. And cultural factors are later included in that conflict process. That's how I understand. So that is why peace education is really important at the grassroots level and early elementary level. Sometimes those cultural factors are too sensitive to address. Yeah, that's true. But at the same time, I see many, for instance, the current Burma, let's say, sometimes those cultural factors are included in the constitution. For instance, certain ethnic groups have a better citizenship primary citizenship than other cultural, other ethnic group who have secondary citizenship. So if those structural legal framework, institutional administrative framework include the cultural factor, it's more difficult to resist because you have to go through the constitutional revision process, for instance, right? So it becomes more difficult if those cultural factors are embedded in political, economic, legal structure. So the best way is to prevent being legalized, being included in the administrative process. That is why early awareness is necessary for handling those cultural factors before it becomes more intractable. For me, conflict sometimes help me to know others, particularly enemies. So it is sometimes okay to get to know more other people, but conflict is bad when it becomes violent. Okay, so when I try to prevent the conflict, it is a time when conflict seems to become more violent. Okay, so early warning for me is like early warning to prevent violent conflict, not all kinds of conflict. Well, if you are party of conflict, you are uncomfortable being in conflict situation. So you would like to remove all kinds of conflict. But for me, it is not always the case. In your workplace, probably you involve in conflict with other colleagues, right? Sometimes I let it go because I know it won't go violent one in my workplace, at least. So I let it go and just listen to other people. But when we say early warning in conflict situation, it usually means, early warning to prevent violent conflict. So what they usually do is they check what the parties' behaviors are. Initially, they ignore each other, polarize each other. But sometimes eventually the situation escalate and start small violence in different places. And that's the early warning system we need to intervene. Because small violence happen, we should really do something to prevent further violence. So that's why if we look at the Mindanao or Southern Thailand, there's always groups that study how many cases violent incidents occurred, in which region it occurred. They track all record and check how many cases are there. Is it increasing or decreasing every week, every month? And they analyze whether the situation is getting better or worse.
Thank you, Achan Yukiko, for handling that first session on the theories, concepts, framework, approaches, and these things, they are very important, especially for us who are teaching peace education, simply because we need to get across to our students the meanings of those terms. And sometimes it can be a bit problematic because sometimes if you look at the literature, the articles, the books, people describe the terms and the concepts in your own way, so we have to be careful. The best thing to do is to read everything and then to look at how people look at the different concepts and the different approaches, and to understand how they have come about with this concept. So if we understand, then it'll be better for us, it'll be clearer for us to then understand and to explain to our students. And also at the same time, we should also have our own interpretations on some of these things. And don't be shy, don't be shy of having your interpretation. I've always told my students that, think for yourself. And that is how we do it, when we advise and supervise students doing thesis, for example. You do a literature review, you look at everything, you understand how everything develop over the years, how a particular concept is discussed from which angle and all those things. By the end of the day, you should have your own definition, based on the context of your own particular situation, based on the context of the case that you are looking at. And we also have been encouraging more and more, people to look at what some people call like local wisdom, local ways of looking at things, and to highlight it as much as possible, because from the studies that many of us do, we also see that this field should not be the should not be the dominion of Western thinkers and philosophers only, because there are also many thinkers, philosophers, scholars, from other parts of the world, including from Southeast Asia. And there is also a way, how we look at things, and maybe some of this can be highlighted. So for example, the different terms that have been discussed by Achan Yukiko, we have the difference between management, resolution, transformation, prevention, containment, suppression. There are also many terms. Sometimes we get confused, which is, the ones to describe a particular situation. But to me, it's also useful when I look at the action, that the action that is involved in any particular approach, in order to try to explain what that particular approach is all about. Okay, the action. Okay, I've always found it useful. So for example, if we want to look at conflict management and conflict resolution. What's the difference between conflict management and conflict resolution? I will always give the example of tending a garden. We have a garden, we have grass in our garden, and sometimes we need to cut the grass, cut the grass, and then mow the lawn, and then put fertilizers and all those things, to make the grass looks better, and to weed out, any weeds and all those things. To me, that is management. Easy, you manage that particular situation. If there are rotten weeds, not so good weeds in the garden, if you just simply cut, you are just managing it, you are not resolving. Resolving is when you take the roots out. You take the weeds out, you go to the core of the problem, which is the root. You take the roots out, that is resolution. So it's as easy as that. Make it easier for people to understand, what the different terms are. And also, I've always also explained it in a way that we know that we also have our interpretations, but then we have to be a bit more neutral in our interpretations, simply because some approaches, they are useful as seen from different angles. Different people see it differently. Not necessarily good or bad, but just different. Even the term conflict, for example. Conflict, from one angle, it is something which is not useful, which is the government, the authorities, see conflict as something that is causing problem with the society. On the other side, the community maybe see conflict as something that is useful because it brings about change. Okay, so we as long as we understand, it's okay. When we write, we understand everything. We try to put it, in as neutral, language as possible. So some other term be like conflict prevention. Okay, and then people are talking that we want to do an early warning. early warning, early response, and we have to prevent conflict, from happening. And this is something useful, conflict prevention. But then we can ask question: is it really useful? Is it really necessary? Shouldn't we allow the conflict to happen? What if the conflict is located, in a country where you have, the power that we, suppress the people, you want to transform the situation, then you have conflict, so maybe we should not prevent conflict from happening. Maybe we should allow conflict to go on, because it brings in new situation, it brings changes. So conflict prevention is how do we say it, a controversial a bit, kind of term, because it has different interpretations, different connotations as applied by the by the people who are involved, on the ground. And then that's when, like Achan Yukiko said, we differentiate between conflict and violence. Conflict is okay, violence is not. Okay, but at the same time, there will be some other people that say, why is violence a problem? Especially, when you are defending yourself, defending yourself from oppression from another group. You are defending your property, your interests, even your own life, to the extent that if you do not use violence, then, your interest, your life, might even be compromised. Okay, so that's where we come into some, some moral discussions, and when it becomes a bit difficult. But, for us as teachers of peace, it is useful to at least understand, what the meaning of each concept would be, and then to allow our students to explore for themselves, how to look at certain things. And I've always tried not to put my own interpretation on, onto the students. I will let you decide. I will not say this is good, this is bad. You decide. But I'll present everything. But then you decide whether you want to choose this or that. There will also be other terms that you will come across, like conflict containment. What is conflict containment? Conflict containment is like conflict prevention, but then it's more about conflict between different states. It's in interstates relation, for example, they talk about conflict containment, containing a particular conflict from disrupting relations between two or more states. So that's the use of conflict containment, mostly in interstate relations. And conflict containment is also the same at the national level. We look at it as conflict suppression. And conflict suppression basically means putting a lid on the conflict, and which is also part of prevention. So prevention, can be expanded to include containment, to include suppression, because they put a lid on the conflict, not allowing actions that might negatively impact society to come out, from the situation. So when you have a conflict suppression in a country, then we have a situation of positive or negative peace. You are not allowing aspirations within society, to come out. You have a situation where even if there are unhappiness, grievances, the people or the conflict actors cannot say anything because it is being suppressed. Okay, so is that good or bad? I would say it is not very good. Not very good. Not very good. I did not say bad, because I do realize that sometimes, if the conflict result in violence, and violence will hurt people and all those things, that will also be bad. But suppressing, a situation to prevent the situation from escalating and expanding is also not very good. Even if there are many different types of conflict, it seems like we are mostly talking about independent movements, liberation movements, and that kind of conflict. that is, well, by accident, because many of us, work in that particular situation. We do acknowledge that there are all types of conflict. We have, environmental conflict, development-related conflict, all sort of conflicts. But if you look at the different, even if there are different types of conflict, if you look at the ingredients of the conflict, there are a lot of generic, ingredients that will exist, in all of these conflicts. The components about the issues, the component about actors, the components about, positive, negative goals and action, behavior and attitude. All of these are there as ingredients of any types of conflict. Then you just fill in the blanks according to the different contexts, different contexts. We always want to focus on the most difficult conflict, and the conflicts that we focus on are conflicts that even when go to the extent of war, the violence is highly involved, and all those things. There are a lot of issues usually in any conflict situation. It is complex, yes, and it needs the involvement of many actors from many backgrounds, focusing on in many areas. A peace process, to be successful, cannot only rely on the main actors doing the peacemaking, because peacemaking is a action that involve the main actors, and they talk to themselves, between themselves, and any decision, then is translated into policies that go from top to bottom. And that should not be the case, because if we want to have a good, outcome from the process, it has to also involve the other different levels of society. Achan Yukiko talk about the level track 2, track 3, and especially track 3, where most of the people are. It should also be our attention, and that is peace building, and looking at peace building as a bottom-up process. And top down and bottom up should come together, and we need to have a comprehensive approach